Happy Earth Day, everyone. My name is Jed. I'm with the City of Toronto Solid Waste Management Services team. I just basically want to welcome everybody to our Earth Day event. This is our third event for this. I guess this is now is the afternoon now. Just give a little context about our Community Reduce Reuse program. As you can see there, what is the Community Reduce Reuse program? Basically, the program is supported by the City of Toronto Solid Waste Management Services Community Reduce Reuse program, also known as CRRPs. You may hear us reference CRRPs. We're just referencing the acronym for Community Reduce Reuse programs. The main objectives of CRRPs is to reduce waste and build sustainable communities. And I basically summarize it in three pillars. First is providing opportunities to reuse, share, and repair items. The second is to offering skills training. And the third is to basically creating spaces for community members to gather. As you can see there, we have 5 community reduce reuse programs: bicycle repair, soil repair, urban harvest, community composting, and share reuse. This morning we did a soil repair as well as a share reuse. And right now, as we mentioned, is the community composting component of today's event. So basically, what is the community composting program? The community composting program equips residents groups with the tools, skills, and knowledge to maintain a community garden and turn yard waste into compost. The program provides composters and information about composting techniques to residents at existing and new community gardens, as well as the tools, equipment, and supplies needed to compost yard waste. It also serves as an opportunity to learn about the importance of reducing food waste and the benefits of composting. Just to give you a little context, for 2020, at the end of 2020, our community partners, our strategic partners, FoodShare, basically were able to host 212 composting workshops last year in 2020. And at the same time, they were able to, and over 132,000 pounds of carbon dioxide saved per year through the program. As I mentioned, the city is partnering with FoodShare on this to deliver the community composting program. And I would like to welcome Orlando Lopez and Alanzo Byfield. Over to you, Alanzo.
Thanks, Jed, and thank you, Orlando. Happy to be here with you guys. So as Jed mentioned, I am the Community Compost Coordinator with FoodShare Toronto, and I will be presenting to you today. We'll be talking a little bit about backyard composting and vermicomposting as well. So we're looking at small to mid-scale composting. And I'd like to thank BCCF as well for putting on this Earth Day presentation. I'm very happy to be here, and I think composting is one of the best ways we can celebrate Earth Day. So without further ado, what I'll do is I will share my screen and we will jump into the presentation. And I do also want to remind you that if you have any questions about the presentation as I'm presenting, feel free to enter them in the chat, and Orlando will he'll give me a hand anyway to maybe answer them or let me know at the end of the presentation what kind of questions you guys have. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. Mildred, are you guys seeing my screen on your side?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Beautiful. Okay.
Yeah, we can't see your face though.
You can't.
If you wanna put your video on, so we can see your lovely smile.
Unfortunately, this camera doesn't work on
okay.
My work laptop. I have to talk to Orlando about that one, getting me a new laptop.
No worries.
Yeah. But I will. You got my little emoticon down there in the corner, so I think it's a pretty accurate representation of what I look like. So you can have to picture that smile throughout the presentation. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So Orlando already read a great land acknowledgement, so I think what we'll do is we'll respect the land acknowledgement that he read, and I do invite people to take the time to reflect and think on ways in which we can be involved on the land in which we operate. I also do want to reflect as well here that we are partnered with Toronto, as Jed mentioned, City of Toronto, in their Community Reduce Reuse program. And without them, presentations like this and the efforts in which we are involved in the community wouldn't be possible. So just want to thank City of Toronto for that. FoodShare. So what we do at FoodShare, if you're not familiar with the organization, we are basically a food insecurity activist community program that we try to help feed families facing food insecurity and fight policy and create better policy around food security. So the reason I'm showing you these pictures here is just to show the size of the scale that we operate. On the left there is our warehouse, which is a very large warehouse, and we have thousands of pounds of food coming in and out, which goes to families throughout the city, throughout GTA. On the right there is one of our project farms in the west end of Toronto. It's called BCI, or Burnhamthorpe Collegiate Institute, and it's a couple of years old. That actually used to be an old soccer field, and it's been converted into a urban farm. The reason I'm showing you guys this is just to show that we do produce a lot of food. We have a lot of produce that's coming in and out of our facility, and we like to close the loop by composting. So in a typical year where we're not affected by COVID and things like that, we're able to do between 50 to 60,000 pounds of scraps. So we do process quite a bit. So today what we'll be talking about, so we're talking about composting. What is it? We'll look at certain terms like aerobic versus anaerobic, why we compost, different methods, and then the composting food web, as well as how to manage common problems. As I mentioned, we'll also talk about vermicomposting, which is worm bins that you can compost at home, inside or outside as well. So forgive me if I'm saying something that you already know. It just helps to define some terms just so that we can have that conversation later on, and so you guys understand what I'm talking about. But composting, just to give you a definition, is the process that works to speed up the natural decay of organic material. And basically what we're doing is just providing an ideal condition for the organisms to thrive, to break down the natural ingredients, to create this very rich natural fertilizer. And from there, we put it back into our soils to feed our plants, to feed our food. And it just it creates that closed loop. We're putting the food back into the soil so that the food can be nutritious for us. Oops. All right, so aerobic versus anaerobic. These are important terms to identify. So I do want to just quickly go over them and keep them in mind as the presentation goes on, because we will come back to these. But aerobic composting is basically what we'll be focusing on mainly. And what that relates to or involves is organisms that require oxygen. So we're breaking down material using mainly oxygen. Now, what's happening here is there's natural occurring microbes that live on the surface of food, in the moisture that's around the food and things like that. We're relying on those organisms. We're basically trying to create a system in which they will thrive. What they do is they break down the material for us, the food that we either can't eat or don't want to eat, and their byproducts are heat, water, and then CO2. Now, I know what you might be thinking, CO2 is a harmful gas, but when we compare it to anaerobic composting, which is the absence of oxygen, so this one over here on the right, those are microorganisms that break down organic material where they don't require oxygen. Now, their byproduct is methane gas. So methane gas is it's a much more harmful greenhouse gas compared to CO2. And CO2 has a bad rap, but if it's used properly and we store it properly, it actually is quite beneficial to the natural environment. So it's important to distinguish between those two, because we really want to focus on aerobic composting, where we're using oxygen, we're creating much more healthy and beneficial compost. The other thing with aerobic composting is it is actually a little bit quicker process when it comes to breaking down materials to be used. With anaerobic composting, even when you go through the system, and sometimes you actually have to then at the end to finish off your compost is actually do aerobic composting to finish it off and make it usable. So this is one of the most efficient, most healthy ways to compost, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. So why do we compost? It's quite simple, waste reduction. It's one method in which we can divert waste from the landfills. I believe the stat currently is about 40% of all food that's grown is wasted. I personally think that number is actually a lot larger. In Canada, that's one of our biggest problems is waste. So by composting, we're actually diverting the compost from, or diverting the food scraps from the landfill. We're able to turn it into a very useful product and go back into the soil. So it just has a huge benefit that way. We're not hauling waste across the cities. We're not impacting our landfills, our overworked landfills as they already are. The other reason we compost is simply for healthy soils. We need to put nutrients back into our soils, keep it healthy so that our plants can thrive and grow lush and healthy for us. With healthy soils, also healthy food. And then if we're eating healthy food, then we're also healthy. So, it's a very simple equation. And it's something that we really need to understand when it comes to growing food. I think any farmer, any effective farmer will let you know that effective farming starts with healthy soil. So composting is one way in which you can achieve that. Not to mention it's also natural. We're not relying on nitrogen products, things that are manufactured in a factory. This is all natural product. It's going to be more beneficial for the organisms in your soil and just for the natural environment around. So, all right. And then I also mentioned, compost acts as a CO2, or sorry, a carbon sink. So what it does is it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere and holds it in the soil where it belongs. The great thing about that is it creates a food system for the organisms that exist in the soil, as well as other plants, to continue to break down and decompose the carbon, but it stays in the soil and it's out of our atmosphere. It's not, in that way, it's not as harmful as it would be. So composting is a great method for that, and that's one of the reasons why we do it. So different methods of composting. We're going to focus on a couple, but just to show you guys that there are different methods in which you can employ. So there's the compost pile or a windrow pile. Basically, the way that works is, you keep all your materials into a section outside, exposed to the elements, and through activation of the bacteria in the compost, they break down the material, it gets hot, and over time, essentially that would break down. You turn it, you add your oxygen. We'll go into more detail about that as we go on, but that's one method. Hot composting is kind of what we will be focusing on for your backyard or at a community center. That's basically where you have your compost in a container. You're trying to get the optimal heat, get the temperature up so that the materials are breaking down quicker, and your organisms are healthier, and they're also they're in abundance and breaking down the material faster for you. Vermicomposting, which is essentially worm poo or worm castings, as other people would call it, and that's basically where we use worms to break down the material. With regular compost, you're using microorganisms. That's, again, things that exist all around us in our air, on our surfaces. With vermicomposting, we're using worms to break it down. And specific kind, we use red wigglers. We'll talk about a little bit about that at the end of the presentation when we get into vermicomposting. And then you can also do a combination. You can do hot compost with vermicomposting or mulching, which is basically layering your materials and they break down near the surface where the materials meet the earth. So as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing mainly on mid-scale, small to mid-scale, something that you can do in your own backyard, even in your apartment, or if you're working with community gardens and things like that. At FoodShare, what we focus on is the 3-bin system, which is this unit right here. The reason we use these is because there's something called critical capacity, where if you are working within a 3x3x3 unit, you will have optimal production of your compost, basically. What that allows for is optimal heat. It allows for moisture retention, and it's also just easier to manage. With those factors in mind, your product will break down a lot quicker, a lot more efficiently, and a lot more evenly as well. You don't want to have a really usable compost in the middle, and then on the outsides you still have food which is visible and unusable. So these are the systems we use. However, it's not the only system, and that's the visual of what we created at FoodShare. Very pretty box. So if that's something that you can see in your backyard or your community garden, please do feel free to reach out to us, because we do build those and we can supply them. We use cedar wood just to let you know. So it's a beautiful and nice smelling at first anyway. For the first use, it will smell great. Don't know what will happen later on, but The reason we use cedar wood is because it actually has a natural occurring chemical in it, which makes it more rot resistant than other woods. So it lasts a long time, it looks great, and very effective. However, it's not the only compost system that you can use. These are great systems for your backyard. These are very common. You know, the city, I believe, supplies some of these, but you can also purchase them from your local garden centers and things like that. The methods in which you'll be using in this are same. They apply to the same. You can apply the same principles to these methods as well. So even though I'm talking about this method here today, just keep in mind you can employ them with this as well if that's something you like to use in your backyard. All right, so now we're gonna get down to it. What do we put into our compost? How do we get our compost activated? And what's the best way to manage it? So technically all organic material will compost. Like as I mentioned before at the beginning of the presentation, we're basically just creating a system to help that, that natural occurring system speed up and become more efficient. But not all things should be added to your compost pile. And we'll talk about what you should and shouldn't put in there. Typically garden trimmings, kitchen scraps, you know, the things that again, we can't or don't want to eat, grass clippings and leaves. All of those things are huge. Those are great for your compost. You'll find that stuff breaks down quite well. It activates quite well, and you're going to get a rich compost out of it. The other things you can also use are like soils, potting mixes. You can use manure, and that's mainly focusing on like cow and horse manure. If you have access to that stuff, then that's excellent. Sawdust, wood chips, all of those things are excellent. One rule of thumb you want to keep in mind though is make sure you chop, mix, and bury. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. But those three things you must do if you want your compost to break down quickly. So we'll go into a little bit more detail here. So what you can and cannot, what you should or should not put into your compost. So as I mentioned, food scraps, excellent. You know, you got your apple cores, you got peels, your egg cartons can go in there, cardboard, tea bags can go in there as well. It may be useful to rip them up and kind of make them expose the leaves and make the bags smaller. You can even put leaves and grass clippings and things like that. What you want to try to stay away from though are meat products, dairy products, cooked food, things like that, because those things will attract pests. All right, and raccoons are getting smarter and smarter, it seems, every year. So they always try to find ways into your bins and your waste and things like that. So by keeping this stuff out of your compost, you're not going to attract the pests. Not only that, but some of these things do carry pathogens with them, and you don't want to contaminate your compost. If you're not able to get your compost up to the proper temperature, killing those things may not be possible. So it's best not to cross-contaminate. Of course, you don't want to put metal objects, glass objects, that stays out. Now, this is an interesting one here. This sometimes gets people is like, okay, well, that's organic, that's growing in my backyard. Why can't I put a weed into my compost? So you can and you can't put a weed into your compost. It all depends. When a weed goes to seed, when it's beginning to send off seeds, that's when you should avoid putting it into your compost. The reason you don't want to do that is because seeds they're very strong, especially weed seeds, they're very strong. They can go dormant. And if I mentioned, if your compost doesn't get hot enough, what happens is that seed stays dormant until you spread it out next year. And now you have a whole garden bed of dandelion or crabgrass, things that you don't want. And speaking of crabgrass, you also want to try to stay away from grass roots. Grass roots can be very, very tough. They last a long time. Again, they can go dormant. So if you have that in your compost and it's not getting to an optimal temperature to kill it, when you spread it out next year, you could potentially be spreading that stuff. So those things you may want to keep away. And with the cooked food as well, oil doesn't break down very well, and you don't want to have oily compost. So any cooked foods that are very greasy, again, you want to keep that stuff away. All right. Now, the reason this is important is because your compost is actually, there's a lot more going on in your compost than one might think. You're basically creating its own ecosystem, if you want to think about it that way. There's a food chain that exists in compost. So it's not just the microorganisms that are breaking down the material. They're going to do most of the work, especially early on when it's getting hot. But you have a lot of these insects, which we don't love to see, but if they're in your compost, then that means you're doing something right. These guys showing up, they're going to help break down a lot of the carbon material. They're going to help break down some of the nitrogen, but they're going to leave their deposits, and they're adding complexity to your compost. They're adding their nutrition to it, and so you're creating a food network. The mites eat some of the fungus that grow. They eat some of the microbes that are in there, and then the larger insects eat those insects. And it's basically just everyone's contributing and depositing to create this complex, rich compost. And the best way to achieve that is through diversity. You want to have a diverse menu in your compost, and the best way to achieve that is through what they call a carbon-nitrogen ratio, or a CN ratio. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the numbers of this, just because it can become a little complicated. Basically, what you want to have is the best mixture of carbon to nitrogen materials. Now, when I talk about what those are, so when I say browns or carbons, those are basically they're the brown materials. So they would be like dried leaves, sawdust. You can use straw, paper. You can even use shredded paper, things like that. They're essential for the compost. You need those in there, but you also do need your nitrogen material. So nitrogen material would be considered anything that is wet or green. You know, we're talking about our food scraps, our vegetable scraps, coffee grounds. Even though technically they are brown, they actually are a nitrogen product, and they do activate quite well. So that's something you can put in there as a nitrogen. Grass clippings, and then your manure. You can use cow, horse, even chicken. When it comes to achieving this ratio, though, of the 25 to 30 to 1, so what that means is basically you want to have 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And what that would look like, I'm not going to get into too much of the numbers, just because it can become confusing. What you're trying to achieve is the right ratio to make sure that your compost is breaking down properly. Now, at FoodShare, what we follow is basically we do about 3 inches of carbon material. We use wood shavings. We do about 3 inches of wood shavings to 1 inch of nitrogen. And we repeat that layered method. We call it the Compost Lasagna, very tasty. We repeat that method until our bins are full. Once a bin is full, you cap it off. You don't add any more material to it. You're going to let that now break down until it's usable. The reason you don't want to add new material once it's full is because if your compost has started to break down and it's already reached its peak temperature, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If it starts to reach its peak temperature and then you add new compost as the material is starting to come down in temperature, you might not have your material break down properly. And again, if you're adding food products and you have pathogens that you're adding to it, that could become problematic. Or you might add some material that's not broken down properly, and then your compost becomes very difficult to use. So it's always best to try to fill your bin as much as you can. Let that be your compost. You're going to turn it. You're going to add water. We'll go a little bit more about the maintenance in a second. But the idea is just basically try not to add new material to it once you've capped it off. Sorry, I'm just gonna, one thing I wanted to mention here. Okay, we'll go into that in a second. Sorry. So I mentioned that you want to reach an optimal heat in your compost. So when you're using carbons and nitrogen product, and if you are keeping it moist and you are turning it properly, the optimal heat that you will hit is about 160 degrees. I say 140 to 160 degrees, and you'll stay at that temperature for about 3 to 4 days. And that's how you know your compost is working properly. That's how you're getting it to the right temperature. You've come up with the right ratio of carbon to nitrogen if you're able to hit those temperatures. It will stay like that for about a few days, and then slowly you're going to see your temperature come down. And that's working. You want that to happen. Basically, the microorganisms are doing their job. They're very active, and that's what's creating the heat from the inside of the compost. And again, in order to achieve that, you have to have the right ratio of materials from carbon to nitrogen. That's not the only thing you have to be concerned about, though. You do have to aerate your compost pile. So as I mentioned before, we're talking about aerobic composting. So this is composting that depends on oxygen. If your compost pile is not being turned, it's not getting oxygen to the material, then the organisms that are inside that pile, just like you and me, they can't breathe, so they will die. And if the microorganisms in your pile are dying, then they're not doing the work, your compost pile will stop breaking down. So it's very essential. Compost is a living, or it's almost like a living organism in itself. It's got to be fed, it's got to be watered, and it needs air. So you got to make sure you're turning your pile. Now, typically what we say is you should be turning your compost pile between every 7 to 10 days if you want optimal productivity. So one thing you can do, if that might not be realistic, you may say, hey, okay, I have a job, I have a life, I can't be turning my compost every week. I can't, it's just not something that's manageable. And I completely understand that. Sometimes we have a hard time keeping up with our compost as FoodShare as well. So there are methods in which you can employ to help you with that. Some people will put very large branches in their compost, and that helps create the porosity between your layers. Some people also put pipes that have holes perforated throughout them. And what that allows is basically oxygen to come through and move throughout your pile. So those are just some methods that you can keep in mind when you're thinking of oxygenation or oxygenating your pile. The best method, and this is why we use the system we have, is literally turning it from one cell to another. That way you're exposing all of your material to all the oxygen, and you're gonna basically give it. It's almost like you're getting a breath of fresh air. If you take a lot of air into your lungs at one time, you kind of get sometimes you can get a little head rush. It's almost like you're doing that. You're giving your oxygen a chance to take in a deep breath and get that energy back. There's other tools you can use as well, such as this plunger. The way that works basically is you push your tool back into the pile of your compost, and as you pull it up, the anchor opens up and pulls the material out, which creates a pocket in the compost and allows oxygen to get in. So there's different methods that you can use. It's definitely manageable, but it's essential. So just keep that in mind. And your compost pile's got to be moist as well. You do have to keep the moisture level up as your compost is breaking down. Like I mentioned before, if we don't have water, we die. Compost doesn't have water, it will go dormant, or it will stop. It will become inactive and stop breaking down. The bacteria and the different microbes that exist on the surfaces, they depend on it. Not only that, but they also depend on it for channels. That's how they move throughout the compost as well. They don't, as you can see, these are pictures of them. They don't have legs. They can't pick up and just walk around the compost. They depend on movement of the moisture to go from different areas in the compost itself. So what we typically say is you want to have, if you picture a damp sponge, if you take a wet sponge and wring it out, and what you're left with, that's kind of what you want your compost to, that's how moist you want your compost to be. If you took a clump of your compost and you put it into a ball, if it holds its shape, you're in good shape. If you put it into a ball and it falls apart, it's too dry, you need to add some moisture to it. If you put it into a ball and there's water leaking out of it, it's too wet. And if it's too wet, there's different methods in which you can correct that. You can add some more carbon material to it, whether that's dry leaves, maybe some paper, or some wood shavings. And I know you said, okay, but Alanzo, you said don't add more material to my compost. Carbon is okay. Carbon, that's not going to be detrimental to your compost if it doesn't break down, especially if you're using chopped up things like shredded paper or wood shavings. Again, that's carbon, and you're adding that. Even if it doesn't break down fully, you're still adding that back to your soil, and keeping it in the soil is where you want it to have it anyway. That will break down eventually over time and become nutrients for the plants and for the organisms that exist naturally in your soil. If you find that the pile is too dry, that's your opportunity to water it. And this is why we say it's best to turn it every 7 to 10 days, because then you can build that relationship with your compost. You can figure out, okay, how often do I need to water it? What state is it in right now? Because it does need that attention. It needs that love and affection from you to make sure that it's thriving. So that's your opportunity to really add some moisture to it if you're checking every 7 to 10 days. And I mentioned, like I said, if you put it into a ball and it falls apart, that's how you know you need to water it. And sometimes it's just visual. You look into it and it's crusty. It's very dry. That's the best time. You can just spray it with a hose, spray your layers as you're turning it. You can add just a bucket of water. And that's something you'll learn the more you do it. You'll build that relationship with your compost, figure out what's the best method and how to employ it. So just some things to think about when it comes to watering your compost. All right, so we've done all of this. We've added our compost, we've chopped it up, we've buried it, we've layered it with nitrogen and carbon. We've been watering it for a few months. We've been turning it, all that kind of stuff. How do we know when it's finished? All right, so compost has a very, very unique smell. Well, I shouldn't say unique. It has a very distinct smell, and it's not smelly at all. That's something that I think people are very fearful of, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But basically what you're looking for is if compost has that earthy smell when you smell it, that's how you know it's finished. That's one way by telling that it's finished. It's almost like if you walk through the woods after a rainfall and you get that very earthy smell, that's kind of what you're looking for. It should be kind of crumbly and loose and very there should be and porous. There should be a lot of air in there, and that's actually very useful. That's how you want it. It will retain more water that way when you put it into your soil. You also know that your pile has shrunk quite a bit. So if you are using one of those compost cells or bins, you might have filled it up, but by the time it's finished, you're getting about a third of what you put in there. And that's just because moisture and gas has been given off, and it's just basically condensed down to its composted form. There are methods by which you can test your compost to make sure that it is finished. So there is the bag test. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to take a Ziploc bag, fill it with some of your compost, seal it, make sure it's sealed, keep it out of the sun, put it in a shaded area. And if you find that there's condensation that builds up on the inside of the bag, that's probably still breaking down. And the reason that's happening is because there's heat that's being generated by the organisms that are still working. And that's what's creating the condensation on the bag. So what that might tell you is just let it break down maybe for a couple more weeks. The other way you can test it is a germination test. Or if you take a seed and you put it into your compost and it germinates, then you're off to a good start. A lot of people will have seeds already germinating on their own in their compost, so you know you're off. You can use it. All right, so there are some troubleshooting methods if you're finding that your compost is not breaking down effectively. So one thing, odors. So this is something I really like to kind of tell it, like we like get the truth out about composting, because composting does not actually have to smell bad, and I know that's the common belief, but compost, if actually managed properly, doesn't have much of an aroma. You'd have to get pretty close to it for you to even notice. And if it's managed properly, it has a nitrogen smell. It's almost like a sweet sour smell versus a rancid odor. If your compost actually smells putrid or rancid, then there's a problem in the management, and there's a way to resolve that. Typically what that is you may have resulted in, your compost may have resulted in anaerobic conditions. So as I mentioned earlier, that happens when the compost is not getting enough oxygen. So the material in your compost has become compact, and the material on the inside is not getting oxygen. That gives off that methane smell. So the best way to do that is to turn it or add some moisture just to get it going again. If you have an ammonia smell, it might be too much nitrogen, and that will tell you that you need to add some browns to it. But if it is managed properly, I promise you, compost actually does not smell very bad at all. Temperatures. So like I mentioned, temperatures is very important. If a pile is too small, or there's cold weather, it's too dry, or there's not enough aeration, or if there's not enough nitrogen, you may not be able to get your compost up to the temperatures that it needs to be. So in those situations, again, it's going to be a lot of trial and testing. You're going to have to maybe make your pile a little bit bigger. You can always insulate the outside of it using different things, like you can pile up your leaves around the outside of your compost. You can use bales of hay. It may need some water, again, just to get the microbes going, or it might need just a turn, just to have your pile turned. Like I said, when you add oxygen to your pile, it's an enormous what it can do. I've had piles which were not doing much. You turn it one day, and the next day you go back, and the temperature, it's come alive. It's completely a different pile. So these are methods in which you can employ. If the temperature is too high, which it's rare that it would ever happen, I haven't seen that yet, but it could be that your pile is too large or it's getting insufficient ventilation. So reduce your pile simply, or just turn your pile. So raccoons and our mice and our skunky friends here. So these are the guys we don't want to see around our compost. The best method to keep these guys away, again, is keeping away the meaty cooked foods and oily foods and things like that. You can also cover up scents by using a little bit more wood shavings or leaves and things like that. Using compost animal proof or animal proof compost bins. Those works out well, very well sometimes as well. And then the other method is don't compost outside at all. You can use a vermicompost bin, which you can do on the inside of your house. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. All right, so you know what, actually, yeah, so let's go right into vermicomposting. So we'll recap the regular composting at the end of this session as well, but I do want to take some time to talk a little bit about vermicomposting and its benefits. So what we'll quickly go over in this section, what is vermicomposting, different methods, the worms that we use, materials, setting up your compost bin, getting to know your worms and things like that. All right, so I'm gonna go through this relatively quickly, just because I want to make sure that we have time to answer any questions. All right, so what is vermicomposting? So as I mentioned, it's just a method of composting through the use of worms. We use red wigglers, and we'll talk a little bit about what they do. But they're basically just breaking down the material, they're digesting it and depositing their waste. And at the end of the cycle, we collect their worm castings, which is worm poop. And it is one of the best forms of food that you can give to your plants. Vermicomposting or worm castings is rich in nitrogen or nitrates, and your plant that nitrates are readily usable nutrients for your plant. So what they do, basically, they're absorbing it right into their leaves, into their energy factories, and they're able to convert it into energy right away. The difference between vermicomposting or worm castings and regular compost. So like I mentioned, vermicomposting is high in nitrates. Regular compost is high in ammonium. Ammonium is something that the plant has to convert into a nitrogen product. So it has to do a little bit more work to get the energy out of it. Whereas with worm castings, it's a readily available nutrient. The plant is going to absorb it a lot quicker. It has to do a lot less work. So it's a great alternative for minimal space. You know, if you live in an apartment, or if you just don't have the room to do the backyard composting, vermicomposting is the way to go. Helps keep waste out of the landfills, as we mentioned before. It produces a lot less greenhouse gases, and it's a great educational opportunity. You know, if you have young children on site that you live with, you know, your children, it's a great way to teach them about, you know, different ecosystems, the anatomy of a worm. And also how to divert waste, literally in your kitchen. You can do this under your sink. So there's different ways to do vermicompost. We typically focus on the bin system, which is basically just an opaque bin. You can get a Rubbermaid bin at your local hardware store. You just drill some holes into it. You fill it with bedding, and we'll talk about what our bedding is. And then you just add your worms, and you feed them weekly, over a certain amount of time, depending on how many worms you have and how often you feed them. The material in there will break down into worm castings. But there are different methods. There's, you know, you can get nicer looking bins for outside. There are these tier systems as well. I haven't tried this method yet. I don't know how well it works, but you can actually put a hole into your ground with a tube, with a pipe, and put material into the tube, and the worms will come up and digest it. But we'll focus mainly on this one, the bin. So when you have your bin, you've purchased your bin, you put drilled your holes into it. Now, how do we add the bedding? So a lot of what vermicomposting, unfortunately, the answer is going to be it depends. So it really all depends on the size of your bin, how many worms you have, how well you're managing it. But basically, what you're going to want to put in there mainly are your carbons. This is what's going to make up their bedding. So You can use a little bit of soil. You can use wood shavings. That's a great one. Coconut coir or coconut shavings basically is the fiber, the ground down fiber of a coconut husk. You can use your shredded paper. You can use egg cartons that which have been shredded, cut up. And then you can also use just a little bit of sand, eggshells. The reason we put this in there is worms don't have teeth, so they can't chew their food. They have a gizzard. So when you put the sand in there with them or the eggshells, it just helps them grind up their food so that they can digest it better. And then of course, moisture. We have to make sure that that your bin is wet and moist for them. As we'll go into the anatomy of a worm, you'll learn that basically they breathe through their skin. So if their environment is dry, the glands that they breathe through that produces the mucus will dry out and they will no longer be able to breathe. So it's important to keep the bin moist. What you're looking for, again, with the, I don't know if I have a slide for it, but I'll talk a little bit about it now. If you were to create your bedding, what you're looking for again is that damp sponge feel. So if you take your bedding out and you squeeze it, you only want to get about 1 or 2 drops coming off the material. If that's what you have, perfect. If it's soaked and you see it's pooling at the bottom of your bin, you may want to empty that water. You may want to add some more bedding. If you're not getting those drops coming out if you squeeze the material, then you may need to add a little bit more water. So like I mentioned, we use red wigglers versus earthworms, which are Canadian earthworms. Red wigglers are not native to Canada. They don't live naturally in our climates because they prefer warmer climates. But for bin composting inside your house, they're much more efficient, or they're just better than earthworms to use. For one, they prefer the climate that your bin will have. You're looking for about 15 to 25 degrees. So room temperature, you can just imagine room temperature. They also live in shallow bedding. Their natural environment is about 10 inches, 6 to 10 inches of vegetation, and they live in that. Not only that, but red wigglers eat up to their body weight in food a day. So these guys are just chomping away all day, every day. They're breaking down their food all the time. So they eat a lot much more than an earthworm will. And they reproduce rapidly. So I think it's once a week they're mating. So they're able to deliver an egg sac once a week, and then within that egg sac you could have sometimes up to 20 worms, but typically it's you'll see maybe 4 to 5 worms coming out of them. And the more worms you have, the quicker they'll break down the material. Earthworms, on the other hand, they prefer cooler climates. They like to burrow. They go to deep soils. They are native to Canada, but they don't eat as often. They don't eat as much, and they don't reproduce as quickly. But not only that, if you were to put them in a worm bin under your sink, they might not like it because, again, they like to go deep down. They like to go where it's cold. I've actually heard stories of worms, unfortunately, killing themselves trying to burrow through plastic because they want to get out of the bin. So if you are going to set up a bin, I highly recommend you don't use earthworms. Use red wigglers. There are different outlets in Toronto where you can purchase them. You can actually purchase them from us at FoodShare as well. So you can feel free to contact me if you'd like. So as I mentioned, the anatomy, I'm going to quickly go through it just because I see we're getting short on time. So the red wigglers have 5 hearts. Amazing creatures, really amazing creatures. They breathe through their skin. So keeping your bedding moisture is important. What can you feed them? All right, so this is very important. So fruits and veggies, essential. That's what they eat. No citrus or acidic foods. So we're talking about obviously oranges, lemons, things like that. And nothing acidic such as like garlic, onions, those kinds of things. You gotta keep it out of the bin because it can affect them. One method is that you can freeze your food before using it. The only reason we recommend freezing your food before you use it is because if there are mites and things like that exist on the food, that will be one method to kill those mites so that you're not adding them to your bin. You can use coffee grounds. They love that. Chop up your food just so you can make it a little bit more accessible for them. If it's a little bit more mushy, they can chew it, chop it down a lot quicker. You want to bury your food 2 inches under the surface of your bedding. So basically what you're going to do, and you want to feed them once or twice a week, what you're going to do is talk a little bit more what this grid is, but essentially when you want to feed your food, feed the worms, pull a corner away from the bin of the bedding, put your food in there, and then pile the bedding back on top of it. The reason you want to do that is just to keep fruit flies away from your food, and also that the worms can access it a little bit better. Grid feeding, the grid feeding system, the reason we come up with this system is so that you can promote migration throughout the bin, so that your worms are moving throughout the bin and they're breaking down the bedding as well as the food. So the best way to do that is to set up a grid. It can be on top of the lid so that you know where it is, or it could just be in your mind. And you want to feed, every time you feed them, you feed them once a week or maybe twice a week, depending on how many you have. You want to feed them in different quadrants. And the reason for that is because you want them to move throughout the bin to break down the bedding as well as the food. So as I mentioned, temperatures it's actually 15 to 25, not 22, so 15 to 25 degrees. So you're thinking about room temperature, maybe your garage, as long as your garage doesn't go to freezing or too hot in the summer. It's got to be damp, so keeping your moisture up. Again, if you're feeding them every week or at least twice a week, that gives you the opportunity to find out if it's too dry. If it's too dry, you can add some moisture. If it's too cold or too hot, then maybe just bring them to different parts of the house. And I mentioned they like alkaline environments, so just trying to keep away from anything that's acidic that you might be adding to your bins. Just try to keep that stuff out. All right, so you've been feeding your worms for quite some time. Depends again how quickly they break down. The material is going to depend on how many worms you have and how often you're feeding them. Food traps, basically, the way that works is you're going to take a yogurt cup, you would put it into your worm bin with some food into it, and cover it up. Just pile up the bedding or the worm castings to the lid. Just let it sit there for about a week. Your worms will go in there, and then you can collect the worms when you're ready to harvest the material. You're going to find that there's still going to be worms inside the bin. So there's different methods in which you can do to separate them. You can just do the separating pile, the pile method, which is you dump your contents onto a table, create small piles. The reason you want to do this is so that the worms, they don't like natural light, so they will go to the bottom of the pile, and then you can scoop the worm castings off. The other method is you can just like sift your pile. You basically take the contents and sift it out with a grate. And that will separate the material from the worms. And also don't forget to check for your little eggs there. That's the next generation of worms. You need those, so you want to take those out and put them into the new bedding. I won't go into too much detail here, but basically the way you want to use your worm castings, you can do direct application. You want to mix into your soil. What they say is about 1 part castings to 3 to 4 parts soil. Worm castings is very dense. It's very nutrient rich. So you don't need a lot of it. A little bit goes a long way. You can also do aerated compost tea. I won't go into too much detail on how to make that. But if you are interested in making your own compost tea, go online, do some searches. There's different recipes that you can use. Things to check out, just to watch out for: fruit flies, springtails. These are mites or bugs that may live in the soil or in the compost bin. The way to get away from that, again, bury the food. Make sure you're putting it at least 2 inches of bedding on top of the food. You can use vinegar fly traps. We're talking about apple vinegar because they're attracted to the sweetness. You can also use those yellow fly traps that you can get at the garden store. If you find you have mites in your compost, freeze food prior to adding it. Or after you harvest your compost, you can freeze that as well, and that may help kill some of the mites. Too wet, too dry, that's pretty basic. If it's too dry, add moisture. If it's too wet, you may have to add some carbon material. If you find that your worms are crawling out of your bin like that, very rare, but it does happen. It could be that the pH is too high. If the pH is too high, then maybe what you're feeding them is too acidic. Or the bin may be finished and it may be ready for them to be harvested. And that's also if you find odor coming from the bin. Typically worm casting bins don't have any odor, but if you do find that there is odor coming from it, it could be because it's ready to be harvested. All right, sorry about that. I'm running a little bit late, but let's see if we can get some questions in here. So I'll turn the power back over to you, and you can share your screen. Orlando, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Were 2 questions in the chat box. I tried to answer right away there, those went, but okay. If you wanted to talk a little bit more, you are welcome. One of the questions is from do we have to take the bags out after compost is ready? Do these bags no harm to our plant? So possible she's referring to uh, the soil web, uh, food web, you know, when you showing the bags.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, do we have to take the bags out after the composting is ready? For example, the peel bags or the worms and something like that.
Like, sorry, the tea bags, did you say?
No, the peel bags, peel back or rolling pin, you know, some people call it different way.
No, I'm not sure which bags. Sorry, I'm sorry, Lando. I'm not sure which bags you're referring to.
Yeah, the same. I asking that for clarification, but I am guessing when you were showing about the soil food web, when you saw the worms and the peel
Yeah.
bags and other critters, where sometimes we don't see it,
Yeah.
it we need to remove those ones before to add it to the garden bed, and if they are harmful for the plant.
Sorry, the bugs?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. My ears are not working today. No, sorry. Okay. The bugs, absolutely not. We don't have to remove those from the compost. Those are actually very beneficial because they continue to break down the carbon material. And then they contribute their deposits. So absolutely keep those things in there. If you see them, it's great. That means your compost is actually very healthy. And if they're in your soil, they're helpful to the soil as well. There are some things you do want to check out for, like if you have slugs and things like that, you want to keep those things away because they could damage your plants. But things like pill bugs or like the little mites and stuff like that, those guys break down the carbon. But you do want to, like, certain pests you want to keep away. So slugs, you can simply just put maybe some eggshells in your soil, and that helps keep them away. Earwigs as well, you don't want them on your plants because they can be harmful, but most of the insects are okay for the soil.
Thanks. Other question it is here. How do you help worms survive in days like today, in the spring when temperatures go down to below freezing?
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. I would say with the compost bins, with the vermicompost bins, it's best to keep them inside, just because you can control the temperature a lot better that way. If you are going to do worm casting bins, I wouldn't recommend that you keep them outside, just because in the summertime it gets a little too hot, and in the winter it's going to be too cold for them. The bin could freeze, for instance, or you could end up cooking your worms. So I'd say it's best to try to keep them inside. You want to aim for that 15 to 22 degree mark. So I would say if it's too cold outside and you typically have them out there, bring them in and let them stay warm. You want to keep them at 15 to 22 degrees.
Yeah. And something where I will add it to as well, and this is helping a lot the pollinators. When in the fall happen, all the leaf from the tree fall down, they providing a blanket to the soil or the earth where we grind our food. And
Right.
that is giving like some kind of temperature to the worms, you know, where they can be okay, providing like moisture in a blanket too as well. So if you having a garden, sometimes we recommend them to leave like those kind of natural products where the nature is providing to you and don't remove it. The other thing it is the worm have the capacity to digging and they can go deeper where they can find in a quite warm condition if in a case you are referring regarding to worms outside in your garden. Um, let's see other question here, Alonso. Um, oh, this is a great question. The worm that we add for composting, do they die when the compost is ready?
So, from my understanding, a red wiggler's life cycle is about 6 months, and maybe to a year if you're lucky. So they will die on their own in the bin, and then they'll just decompose. But if you capture the eggs and make sure you hold on to those and put them into the new bedding, then you're going to get a new generation of worms, and the cycle will just continue. So the worms do die. They should, I mean, when you're harvesting them, you shouldn't be, you should be able to keep them alive. They're pretty resilient creatures, but you do want to be gentle when you're putting them from one bed to another. But yeah, in the natural, in the sifting or in the separating of worm castings from worms, you do want to be gentle, make sure that they survive, put them into the new bedding live. But yes, they will die naturally. They have their own natural life cycles. So the generation or the colony will regenerate as time goes on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, to come into this workshop about composting, community composting, and vermicompost too as well. If you have, we are wrapping here right now because it's coming in other workshops where our facilitators are ready to start to doing the next workshops. So if you have any information or you want to learn more about the program, feel free to contact Alanzo Byfield. Now in the slide, you can see Alonso email is alonso@foodshare.net, or to myself as orlando@foodshare.net. Thank you so much and keep safe.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Orlando and Alonzo.